Alright, before even beginning the video, I just want to take a little shot at the term public. Now, the term public is a misleading and emotionalizing term. First off, are public schools, what I call public schools, say, a high school, for example, is it as open to the public as a private mall? No, a private mall is more open to the public than a public school. The people who can go into a public school are only people, of a certain age who are, prescribed and identified by agents of the state to come to these buildings at a certain time. For the most part, you get some people who can come in, parents can come in occasionally. I mean, you can't have all the parents in all the time, right? You have some speakers coming in, right? So there's some leeway. But for the most part, it's rather prescribed who is in these facilities at any given time. So no, it's not open to the public. So, well, maybe by public they mean it is funded by the state. Okay, how does that make it public? That just makes it funded by the state through, compelled taxation. Well, you could say it's public if the state is somehow a manifestation of the will of the public. And first off, the most you could say in a democracy is that it is the will of the voters. But even that's only if what occurs is the will of the voters. If the voters actually wanted compelled schooling facilities like these. So anyway, the term public is misleading on multiple counts, and I don't want to focus on that, so I'll just move on to Nykytyne saying that he's not a fan of the status quo, and that in his previous video he kind of alluded or implied that he was a fan of the status quo, and that is not the case. In fact, he is for significant reforms, you see. What are the reforms? Well, one is paying teachers more. The other is online classes. Okay, so before dealing with that, this presupposes that these compelled education facilities, these compelled schooling facilities are interested in finding the best way to get material across to students. An example that sticks out in my mind, and I apologize for my vagueness here, but I recall some woman who came up with this teaching method for reading and vocabulary. This wonderful new teaching method. She had shown how students or how teaching this way to people caused people to read earlier, caused people to understand how words worked better, and it was a fantastic way of teaching people things. And she went around on a whole bunch of daytime talk shows trying to get to moms, say, hey, teach your children this way. And I was wondering, well, if this is a fantastic way of teaching reading and vocabulary, the first place you should go is these public schools, right? But of course not. And if you think about it, what you have in these compelled schooling facilities is you have a bunch of people who work at these places. They have a doctrine that is, that is pretty well established. If they want to change the doctrine, any change has to go through various legal channels. So it is institutionally resistant to change. Even if the teachers are angels and the teachers are really interested in the well-being of their students and they think they're social servants or public servants or whatever, it doesn't matter. Right? It is institutionally resistant to change. What else was I going to say? Oh, Prussian model is the model that most of these compelled education facilities are done by, and the Prussian model was around in the 1870s and in Germany at the time under Bismarck. And what it is it's what we all know. Right? You go to a building, go to a little room. You have a teacher at the front of the room telling kids, this is it, right? This is what you have to learn, all right? And then sends the assignments down to all the kids. Right, and it's a model that was designed to indoctrinate, right? And after the first generation of this Prussian model, the nation of Germany came to be, because you had a whole generation of kiddos going into these schools, and they were teaching them, the doctrine, right? The doctrine of nationalism, the doctrine of German nationalism. We're all part of the German nation. Enough of this little colloquial. You're not a Swabian, you're not a Saxonian. Right, you're not a Rhinelander. No, you are a German, the German nation, the one nation, and the compelled schooling centers were instrumental to that. Now, I'm not saying that the compelled schooling centers today are as bad as they were in Prussia at the time, but and teachers, I mean, they don't hit people like back in Prussian Germany. You know, how horror stories of teachers hitting kids and having with like a, and the thing they hit them with were designed to cause blisters to rise and all sorts of nasty stuff. I mean, that's not what I'm saying. Right? I'm not saying that it's as brutal as Prussia, but what I am saying is that it's resistant to change. Right, and so they're following the same basic model. Now they have discussions, right, which is not something you would ever see in a Prussian classroom. But it's institutionally resistant to change. The basic format of these classes is the same. There has been no or almost no institutional change from that basic model is what I'm saying. The individual teachers are more humane, and there's laws against hitting kids. But other than that, it's the same institutional model. Right? I'm not saying it's as brutal. I'm saying it's evidence that these places are resistant to change. Anyway, then Nykytyne2 was talking about online classes. I'm fine with that. You don't need a state to do that. Then Nykytyne2 was talking about testing. Yeah, testing is great. You got to have some sort of metric. People who are against testing are dumb. Then Nykytyne said something about the students are partially to blame. No. Let me put it this way. Let's say you take a bunch of pigs and you try to teach them to sing. And you send them up in a row, and you try to teach the pigs to sing, and the pigs just try to do whatever they think they can do to get out of this harassing situation, because you force them there, right, and you're trying to teach them to sing. And you have one teacher who's really adamant about teaching pigs to sing. He really wants to teach these pigs to sing, but then you have one pig who's like, "What do I have to do?" Let's imagine pigs can talk. What do I have to do to learn how to sing? Right? Is this going to be on the test? Is this going to be on the exam to get out of here? Right? Are you going to blame the pigs? No. No, they were forced to be there. Not their fault. If you force someone to come to a place and you try to teach them something and they're not enthused about learning it, whose fault is it? Then Nykytyne2 starts talking about teachers being underpaid, and this is a really bizarre thing for anyone who understands how prices come about. Let's say you had the state or any local government or whatever hiring aerobics instructors, and these aerobics instructors were to come out and they were going to teach everyone aerobics, and everyone was required to once a week or whatever go to an aerobics session. How much is the correct amount to pay this aerobics instructor? I don't know. There's no clue. The price for everything else, for every product or any service not provided by the state, comes from a nexus of exchange. Comes from people figuring out the prices of inputs and buying that, and then trying to sell something and make a little more from that than they sell it for, right? Minus consumer surplus. And so when you want to buy a plasma TV, right, you're probably buying it for less than your maximum. That is, you view the plasma TV as worth more than what you're paying for it. Right? And so you have all these nexus of exchanges, and so prices are regulated in that way. As the price of a burrito is regulated in the way, and it's an incredibly complicated system, but it's not centrally planned, and so that's why it can be so complicated. No individual has to figure out what the price of a burrito has to be, nor do they have to figure out what the price of a service has to be. But when you're dealing with the state and you're dealing with the price of teachers, you get into a calculation problem. And so Nykytyne2 says teachers are underpaid. How does he know? Well, there's no metric. Right? That's a non. That statement is non-cognitive, or that is, it is not truth-apt. I mean, it's because there's no standard by which to compare the proper price to. Then he started talking about anarcho-capitalist. Just something to say that the term anarcho-capitalist is misleading. First off, capitalism, I believe, started off as kind of a slur from Karl Marx. He was talking about capital, and he was talking about the capitalists. So the term capitalist is meaningless. Some people say, well, Enron is capitalist, BP is capitalist, and people who call themselves capitalists will say, no, that's crony capitalism. I'm for blah, 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 blah. So the term capitalist is meaningless. The term anarchism means communism. Anarcho-communism is anarchism. So to call yourself anarcho, well, that's obviously not what these people are. And to call themselves capitalists, well, that's meaningless. So the term anarcho-capitalist is a meaningless term. Then Nykytyne says that it's not really forced, that compelled education facilities, it's not really forced, because you can have private schooling or homeschooling. and that people should be forced to do these things. Oh, wait a minute. So yeah, Nicotine pretty blatantly contradicted himself in a rather silly way. Then the problem is that even private schools, they have to be approved by the state, right? And so they have to follow the same basic models. Private schools, and I put that in quotes because the term private and public are misleading, as I said before. These schools still have to follow the same basic model, the same basic Prussian model of kids in a room teaching something, and they have to teach to the same standards of what the state says that people should have to learn. That is, they have to learn some history according to state doctrine, what kind of history they have to learn. So it's not really private. It's a system determined and approved by the state. Same with the homeschooling system. And now what you say, we need to have these state compelled education facilities for everyone, because not everyone can afford either private schooling or homeschooling, which is typically even more expensive than private schooling. Well, the problem is, why are you forcing people to do any of this? Right, that's an easy solution to all of this. And I don't have the time to go into all this, but private schools generally are way less expensive than public schools. Furthermore, they'd be even less expensive on a total market, where you could have people going up until they're 16. And I'll link to the video I did on this, where I explained all this and how the poorest of the poor would be best off in a total market of schooling. And then Nykytyne2 really flew off the handle. I know I'm going back and forth between addressing the audience and addressing Nykytyne, but Nykytyne2, you really flew off the handle in talking about speculating. You're speculating that there would be a two-tier, that without compelled schooling there would be a two-tier system of an intellectual elite. Now, I don't know what you're talking about. Are you talking about technical skills? Well, no. The reason no for technical skills is because that's part of the market, right? You don't need compelled schooling to have people to go learn to be mechanics or go learn to be computer programmers, because there is an inbuilt incentive to go learn those skills. You'll earn money to learn those skills. And in the absence of a state with all online classes and technical schools, and you're already starting to see it, there's no reason for that kind of stuff. So if you're talking about a technical skill gap, no, because there's an incentive for people to learn that anyway, right? Money, right? It's the same reason people work at all. So that's false, and we know that praxeologically. As for the humanities, this is something I really disagree with. That people need to be taught the humanities, history, social sciences. The reason being is that yes, there will be certain people who are interested in history and the social sciences much more than others, and they're going to know way more than others. The solution to that is not to force people to go into these compelled education or compelled curriculums where they are taught what the humanities and social sciences elite believe on certain issues, right? That is what we have. That is compelled schooling. It solidifies the intellectual elite, and it solidifies interpretations of history, right? And for example, would be the New Deal. Like Ludwig von Mises, for example, predicted that there was going to be a bust, right? He predicted it to the month that it happened. He turned down a lucrative job as a banker in Vienna because he didn't want his name associated with the crash. Right? Do you hear about that? No. Do you hear about how the stock market only began to gain value once the price controls from the NRI were removed? No, I don't hear about that. Do you hear about how virtually all of the New Deal programs were expansions and rebranding of programs pioneered by Hoover? No, you don't hear about that. Do you hear how Roosevelt ran on a platform of limited government, campaigning against the big government Hoover guy? No, you don't hear about that, right? So, but that is the institutional interpretation of the intellectual elite, right? And having these compelled schooling centers gives them even more power because all that filters down.